Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am O'Brien McMahon, and this is People Business. In this episode, I'm joined by Linda Rossetti, Executive Director at the Transition Institute. Linda is a business leader, Harvard MBA, and pioneering researcher who has dedicated her career to advancing our understanding of personal and organizational transformation. She is the author of 2 books, Dancing with Disruption and Women in Transition. She is also the host of a podcast called Destination Unknown. In this conversation, we go really deep on disruption. If you've lived any amount of time on this earth, you know that you are going to be facing some disruptions, those things that get in your way, that change the trajectory of your life. And often you can't predict when they're coming. Sometimes, though, they're self-inflicted. Sometimes we just get to a point where we say, it's time to do something else. This isn't working. And we disrupt ourselves. And we get into all the different facets of what disruption looks like, what happens to us during a disruption, and how we can work through that and make a positive transformation, whether that's totally upending our lives and changing how we live and how we think, or whether it's just making a little tweak here to get ourselves better aligned with how we really want to live our life. This episode is truly for everybody. I really hope you enjoy it. Here is Linda Rossetti. Linda, welcome to the show. I am excited to have you on here talking about a very interesting topic today in disruption. And I have read your book, Dancing with Disruption, and really enjoyed it. And you realize how many disruptions there are in life. And we've all been through a lot of them. We've all been through the same one, at least in the pandemic, but there are a bunch of other disruptions that come into our lives. And so I'm excited to unpack this conversation today. Welcome.
Well, O'Brien, thank you for having me. It's nice to see you, and I'm glad to be here.
Let's start with defining some terms. I think that would be a good place. What is the difference between a disruption, a change, and a transformation?
Well, those are excellent terms, and why not start right there, right? Disruption, as you already mentioned, we're all familiar with it, right? I mean, it can happen on the way to the office, right? There can be a traffic jam, and, all of a sudden our schedule for the day is thrown into, haywire. But then there are other disruptions that can be more meaningful, right? We unexpectedly lose a job, or the company that we've worked with for a long time goes through a merger, or all of a sudden we have a health crisis, or we lose a loved one, right? These are meaningful, sometimes expected, sometimes unexpected junctures that we get to in life. And the work that I'm most interested in, that I think can be the basis for our conversation today, are what I call gateway disruptions. And those are disruptions that actually have us question our sense of self. That's kind of a funny term, sense of self. And I think of it in a way that we all kind of have this mental model, who we are, how we operate in this world, how the world is supposed to be. And the disruptions I'm most interested in is what happens when that kind of mental model gets challenged. And oftentimes we become aware of that in 2 different ways, right? One way we become aware of it is our normal level of functioning becomes unattainable, right? Maybe you're somebody, O'Brien, who does 1,000,001 things every day. And then for whatever reason, you get to this place where you're like, wait a minute, I can barely put my shoes on in the morning. There's something the matter, right? Or the other way we come into it is where we really become aware that something's wrong, but sometimes we can't even name it, right? There's something here. And, I go through lots of stories in the book about people who have, for a number of reasons, arrived at this place. I think that that's the first thing I talk about in the book, which is a lot of times we think we're kind of single-threaded. We say, okay, my disruption is a job loss, so let's all convene around job loss. What the book tries to do and what my work tries to do is to say, look, let's just all assume that we have different paths to this moment of upset or upheaval in our sense of self. Okay, so let's just be agnostic. We don't care how you got here. Let's just assume that's what we're here for. And from there, we can have a really interesting conversation, because from my research, I've spent the better part of 10 years talking with people who've gone through all manner of disruption, but also really getting into the scholarly research about what happens when people are going through these periods. And I kind of build this upon, O'Brien, nearly 30 years of working with transformation in the workplace. So on top of all of that, I think that there's really an opportunity to spend new energy on understanding disruption And that's what gets us to the other two terms that you asked me about. But I'm going to pause and let you tell me I should stop and say,
No,
that's
keep going.
disruption. Right. So
Keep going.
you also said, well, what's the difference between, change and transformation? And this was something that was astonishing to me, right? I began this work and really sat down and listened to hundreds of people who were at these moments. And what was shocking to me is there was this pattern that emerged, regardless of what got them to this point in their lives. There was a pattern that emerged that said, you know what? We really interchange these words: change, transition, transformation. We interchange them all the time, when in fact they mean very different things when we're at these moments in our lives when there's a shift in our thinking about who we are. At those times, changes are really used to represent an intact sense of self. We use change to achieve a certain goal. They're like an alteration or a variation on a known set of things, right? So, okay, I'm a banker, and maybe I've lost my job at the UBS or at JP Morgan Chase, but I want to be a banker, and I make a variation or an alteration, and I take that skill set and I go to another bank, right? We're leaving intact really our thinking about who we are, but we're making a very goal-oriented alteration. That's a change. When we get into the world of transformation or transition, what we're doing is we're allowing our sense of self to be unstable for a while. And in that, we're re-examining the assumptions about who we are and how we make meaning in the world. And so different, very different from change, where that self-concept is intact. It's kind of in the bedrock. We're allowing ourselves to ask some questions when we approach a transformation or a transition. And it's in that moment where we have this opportunity for growth. And ultimately, right, the longest answer to your first question I could ever give, but ultimately, what I now understand after a decade of research is that disruptions are very often a signal that we have an opportunity to grow. And when we grow in adulthood, what we're doing is we're recentering the expectations and definition of who we are. And that sometimes means adding new things, right? Sometimes it means letting go of some things we've held for a long time. And it's really in that recentering that, I found kind of the most traction in my work. So these terms are important, right? Disruption, change, transition, transformation. They're beautiful words that I think if we pause a minute and think about it, they can really begin to help us respond differently, right? And so if somebody stopped me on the street, O'Brien, and said, "Hey, Linda, what do you do?" I would say, I really do some work to help us respond differently to disruptions in our lives. Because if we can respond differently, we can open up this incredible, expansive tomorrow. Because too often what I've seen is that people stall, disengage, or retreat at these moments of disruption. And that's really the heartache, right? That's the crisis, because, we leave all these incredible talents on the sidelines when that happens. And whether it's in a workplace context or in a personal context or, in 1,000 others, really that's the tragedy. Like, we don't have the luxury in this world to leave untapped the incredible skills that so many have. If we respond differently to disruption, I think we can deploy more of those skills.
Well, I think that's the podcast right there. I think we're done. No, that was fantastic. And thank you for sharing all of that. And I'd love to unpack some of that a little bit. And one of the things, I want to go back to one of the first things you said, which is we all experience disruptions, expected and unexpected. And I think when we think about disruption, just the word disruption, often we conjure unexpected disruptions, things that derail us. But to your point, some of them can be expected. We have 2 young boys in our house, and they were huge disruptions to our way of life. They were huge disruptions to, in my wife's case, her career, to both of our sense of self and our identities. And we were very excited to welcome our boys into the world, but it was a big disruption. So I think understanding that even the things that we get really happy and excited for, those big changes, that they can be disruptions that need to be processed as well.
No question. I in my research, I heard so many stories of the planful things that became disruptions, right? Even, the long anticipated promotion, right? Somebody who's worked for years and years and years to get this opportunity, but then is all of a sudden kind of thrust into this new place. And even their relationships with their colleagues are radically different because of this new role. This notion of disruptions can be expected, unexpected, and sometimes they're events. We welcome a new child. Congratulations on 2 stars in your household. But they can also be realizations, right? There's this woman in my research who happens to be featured in the book, her story. She was this very talented MD, PhD woman. Her name was Lakshmi, and she went to this very Big Ten Midwestern university, and she was just fantastic in her early 30s. And she said, all of a sudden I came to this realization, like, this isn't who I want to be. And it was crushing because she said, I think she was 32 or 33 at the time. She's like, I've never even dreamed outside of this persona, right? This is who I was going to be for as long as I can remember, certainly since I was a young teen. And she had worked day and night to do it. And the reason why I mentioned her story is that when she came to the realization, it first came to her in intense pain, right? She had these like debilitating headaches, and she was somebody who was very physically fit and very aware of her body. And she's like, I kept asking myself, what does my body know that I don't know yet? And she said, it was part of this path that allowed me to begin to ask myself new questions. And I think that that's a lot of the work, we can do here today, O'Brien, is encourage people, instead of being completely terrified at these moments of disruption, is invite them to ask new questions, right? Because, Lakshmi ultimately found that there was some runway for her in trying to think about how she might take her skills from that MD PhD environment and go to new things. And the fascinating thing, and I won't like give away her entire story, but she said, ultimately she got to this new place, this new employment. And it took a while. There were a couple of steps for her to get there. And she said, the most astonishing thing was my coworkers, they think I'm funny and that I'm a good leader. And she's like, these things are astonishing to me. She's like, this was never in the cards. And I offer that to say, when we have these intact assumptions about who we are, we also drag along with that the assumption of what the upside is. And I think the fascinating thing about my research is those who are willing to step into this period of instability, right? Being able to rethink the assumptions about who we are, the upside is always like so far beyond what they ever imagined, right? It just is this enormous accelerator. People use words to describe it like enlivening and joyful and freeing. And those aren't people that were prior searching for something. They were perfectly fine, thank you very much. And yet they got to these places of such expansiveness that it's kind of interesting. So so anything can bring us to these moments. And I think that there takes some courage to recognize that, hey, wait a minute, this is a disruption. And what might it have in store for me?
Yeah. When I was reading the book and read her story, it reminded me of a friend of mine who was very successful, was making a lot of money, had a girlfriend that he was really into, and he had just had in his mind that he needed to work harder to make more money, and that was how you succeeded, was you just worked harder. He read The 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss, and it talked all about how time is the currency. You can use money to do things with your time, but time is really the limiting factor in our lives, and you have to prioritize for time. And it rocked him. It shifted his whole worldview, and he realized that he could work harder only up to a point, and then what? And if he was spending all of his life working, then what was the rest of it for? And he had brought it up to some of his friends, and they had said, well, maybe you just need to break up with your girlfriend. And he's like, no, that's not it. And they said, well, maybe you need to quit your job. And he's like, no, that's not it either. It was just a fundamental worldview change. And he really struggled with it for a little while. And I was glad and privileged that he brought it up to me, and I had to actually spend some time thinking about it. And so I was able to talk through it with him and hopefully make him feel like he wasn't going crazy. But he, fast forward, and he still works really hard. He's actually with the same woman, and they have a young family, and he's really doing really well. And he didn't make that many changes, but he just reprioritized how he's living his life. And sure, that relates in some changes, but it's not like he went down an entirely different path. He just is living his life according to a different set of values. But that disruption was really hard to work through, to let go of a set of values and get into another set of values. So I guess that's my next question is, when we face a disruption, expected, unexpected, what happens to us?
Well, it's a great question, and it sounds like your friend was at this very same place. We have the opportunity to make a choice. And that sounds like a very simple statement, but in fact, it's not, right? Because if you think about it, we dress choices in this frame that says they're hard. They can be really risky and scary. And I think ultimately, what I try to do in the book is really empower people to make a choice and to do it with knowledge, right? So they make an informed choice, so that it isn't like, oh my goodness, it's either this or I throw the baby out with the bathwater, like it's something totally new. If people really understand what's happening about choice, the terrifying piece goes away, right? And it becomes so much more purposeful. One thing that's interesting in what your friend was going through and what all the people go through as they move through a choice that looks like a transformation is that really in our brains, we think that it's event driven, right? We're going to go from working 90 hours a week to working 4 hours a week, right? I mean, I really want to meet the person who knows how to do that, but I love the concept, and I'm applauding what the new frame of mind has given your friend and his family. But ultimately, what's happening for all of us is it really isn't about events. What it is about our willingness to re-examine the assumptions upon which we anchor our sense of self. And that sounds like an awful lot of words, so let me unpack what that means, right? There was a woman in my work who said, I want to be a general manager by the time I'm 40, right? And that was what it was all about. Like every waking minute, it was about that. And she got to be about 37, and she's like, I'm not sure that holds water anymore, because I'm kind of interested in this and this and this, right? And so what's happening, right? That's a very simple example to say what's happening when we're going through a transformation is that we're taking the assumptions that for whatever reason became bedrock for us, what we anchored who we are on. And we're saying, what? Maybe some of those we've outlived their useful life and we're going to let them go. Maybe there's others that we had kind of put on a back burner, but we want to move them forward. And maybe there are others that, frankly, we've ignored or never even been aware of, and we want to bring them in. We might even want to make them center stage. And so ultimately, this notion of what's happening, the choice that we're making, is that we're willing to re-examine the assumptions upon which we rest our sense of self. And once we begin, and by the way, we don't do it en masse, right? We don't say, okay, here I am. Well, we're going to change it all. We usually go in with one assumption, okay, how I work or the priority I put on work. But if you look at patterns of how people walk through these massive transformations, is they usually begin in a very iterative process. They say, my spirituality or my work life or my relationship, there's something about it I need to really kind of interrogate, although that seems like such an aggressive word. It's just question. And ultimately that leads to this cascade of more and more. People really they walk into this enormous transformation because it allows them to, as your friend said, to sit right where they are, but greet it with an entirely new lens, right? Very often in our mind, we hear the word transition and we say, whoop, we got to leave, right? I'm leaving a job, I'm leaving a relationship, I'm leaving a geography, whatever. When in fact, the research says you don't have to leave anything. What you need to do is use a new lens to recenter how you think about who you are and the way you make meaning in the world. And once you're willing to do that, you can sit right where you are and be entirely different. There's you can watch through the centuries. There are scholars who reference, it's as if I've come out of a mist, right? It's like they see the world in an entirely new lens once they're willing to kind of make this choice. And in the book, I use this very simple analogy about climbing a mountain, right? And we all have a picture in our mind that a mountain is this conical shape that as we go up, we gain elevation. Only when we go through disruption, we're on this kind of very interesting mountain where we can go around loop to loop all the way around, but we never gain elevation, right? And that's change. So if we make the choice of change when we encounter a disruption, right, we're leaving intact the assumptions about who we are as an individual. So we go around the mountain but we stay on the same horizontal. And we can think, oh, we're making great choices. Say, okay, I used to work for Bank of America, but they fired me. So now I'm going to go work for, TD Bank. Okay. And so we go around another loop on the mountain. There might be a thunderstorm now this time, so that the trail seems that much harder to traverse. But in fact, we've gained no elevation. The only way we gain elevation is when we ascend. And what ascension requires is that we kind of really step back and think about, what holds value and meaning to us. And when we're willing to do that, all of a sudden we get to go up. It's like taking the elevator to the next set of, loops around the mountain. But when we do that, all of a sudden, if we continue to make those choices, we invert the mountain, right? It becomes so much more expansive as we go up. And so I think ultimately what's happening when we encounter disruption is we are getting this invitation to say, are you willing to make a choice? The reality is if we don't know anything about disruption and transition, we, like all busy people, we kind of throw the invitation like in the recycle bin unopened. Like we don't even think about it. We just keep doing. When in fact, there's this goodness if we actually stop, open the invitation and make a choice. Like your friend or like Lakshmi, there's incredible traction that can happen if we're willing to step beyond this kind of intractable view of who we are.
Yeah. Well, to your point, I love what you just said, and I love the imagery of circling the mountain versus scaling the mountain. And the story I told about my friend, everybody was suggesting that he make changes, but he was trying to make a transformation. And he was trying to go up the mountain, and they were saying, no, just keep going around the mountain. And he didn't change a lot in his life, and yet the way that he views his life and the way that he feels about living his life has totally changed. And I think most people probably by default move around the mountain versus go up the mountain because it's the easier path, because you don't have to let go of something that you're holding on to. You can keep everything you have and just move to a different spot. So it seems like adding new identities is much easier than letting go of old identities, right? I'm a salesperson and I want to become a scuba diver. Great. I can go learn how to scuba dive and I can take my vacations and do that and I can add that. But to be a salesperson and a scuba diver and suddenly realize that sales isn't doing it for me anymore and now have to go be a researcher or something, to make that shift is a lot harder. So can you talk about how people can let go more easily? I mean, I don't think it's ever easy. I think this is probably one of the hardest things to do. What advice do you have for people who feel like they need to let something go in order to elevate themselves, but are afraid or struggle to do it?
Absolutely. And I'm so happy you asked me that question. And I think that, let's face it, we all have this fear, right? Even the most courageous among us have this fear of like, my goodness, what is it going to mean if I let this go? And so I think there are two things I would say. The first is practice little bits before you do this colossal, okay, I'm cutting the rope. And so that when I mean practice, it's interesting, I mentioned a minute ago that, we all think about transitions or transformations as leaving something. I'm leaving a marriage, I'm leaving a geography, I'm leaving a career. When in fact, the only common denominator is that in transitions, we're turning up the volume on our own voices. And this sounds kind of silly, but it's important to think about. When I say turning up the volume on our own voices, I'm not meaning what you hear as I speak, right? I've been speaking for many minutes. You know now that I'm a Bostonian, right? It's very clear. But really, what I mean by voice is our truth, our essence, right? Kind of who we are. And turning up the volume on that is really our willingness to allow others to see that. Right. And that's not necessarily obvious. Look, I can all day say, okay, I'm a business person and I'm going to add on scuba diving and then I'm going to paint and I'm going to learn a new language and I'm going to cook. Right. And I can bolt on all this stuff and I can never in all of that turn up the volume on my voice. Right. If I'm willing to, I need to, one, think about what is my voice, right? Do I know, right? And I'm not saying that in a silly way, right? Very often in life, as we kind of go through adulthood, it's very easy to adopt voiceovers from others, right? Kind of in a provisional sense. It's like, oh, that sounds good. Let me try that. Or that sounds good. Let me try that. So
my mom always told me this was important.
Of course. Or,
Yeah.
parents, anyone, right? Anyone, faith, like, my religion says this, right? Whatever it is. And so the first step is kind of being aware of voice. Like, what is it? What is it that holds value to me, right? Not to my mom, to whomever, right? And then am I willing to use it in the environments I'm in? And so when I said it's good to practice with little steps, right where you are, you can make alterations, right? Today in your boss's staff meeting, you can ask one more question, but one more question that's more aligned with your own voice, right? And that sounds simple, but it is very hard if we really think about that step as being really revealing more about who we are, not, okay, I'm supposed to close the books this month. It's, wait a minute, we're forgetting about, we haven't given a raise to this division in 2 years. What are we going to do? That sense of fairness might be something that's very aligned with your voice, right? So the first step I would say, how do we let go, is raising our awareness to voice and taking small steps to get comfortable living with voice. And I know you're from Chicago. I remember doing this fantastic seminar out in Chicago with a bunch of nonprofit leaders. And right after I finished, voice was a very big theme throughout the whole day. And right after I finished, these two women came up to me, and one woman was in tears. She's sobbing. She says, I can hear my voice. It's screaming at me. But the concept of acting in alignment with her voice was terrifying. She's like, the consequences are too high. Right. So to that, I'm saying, like, let's get used to taking teeny small steps so that we can get a comfort level of what it feels like to act in alignment with our voice, so that we don't get to this point where this very capable woman was in tears, terrified of taking a step in that direction. Right. And then this other lady who was so silly standing right next to her, she put her hands above her eyebrows and she swung her head from side to side as if she was a seafarer, looking for a distant land. And she's like, voice, I haven't seen my voice in 30 years. Right. Long-winded answer to your question, how do we let go? The first step is trying to get a sense for the status of our voice and our willingness to use it.
Can we just unpack that a little bit further,
course.
Even because how do we know, like, how does that woman who hasn't found her voice in 30 years, or how does somebody who's had all the voices piled on them, how do they know? Like, what's the exercise look like to figure this out?
Yeah. And so thank you for asking, because in the book, I've had this great good fortune of working with all these people over a decade. So every chapter in the book offers exercises that are designed, they're created to help people begin to answer the questions that you're asking me. There are two that are really terrific and incredibly powerful to do exactly what you're asking, right? The first, for voice, how do we do it? How do we even begin to know if we've had a voiceover of other people for so many years? There's a storytelling or a narrative exercise I offer in the book that asks people to imagine that they introduce themselves to me, right? Just off the cuff, imagine, O'Brien, that you and I get to meet for the first time. And I say, okay, introduce yourself. And you say, hey, this is who I am. I've done this job. I have 2 lovely children, a wife. I'm incredibly grateful. That's who I am. And I'm not diminishing all the other millions of other things I could say, O'Brien, because you have an incredible career and contributions that you've made, but I'm going quickly. And so the second piece of that, I would say, okay, O'Brien, now tell me one thing that has value to you. It could be anything. In fact, why don't we do it right now, O'Brien? Tell me one thing that has value to you.
Creativity.
Okay, so now I want you to introduce yourself to me. Imagine it's for the very first time, but I want you to use creativity as the anchor for that introduction. How would you do it?
So, it's interesting. So I will do this, but what is interesting is it immediately feels more self-absorbed. And so I immediately start to edit myself. Yep. That's what I notice, is that I immediately start to go like, well, I don't want to brag or whatever, but I'll push through that. And what I will say is, I'm O'Brien McMahon. I do a lot of different work that really all centers around the opportunity to be creative. I like being creative with companies and how they approach their people strategy. I like being creative in writing, and actually have a children's book coming out this fall. My wife is also very creative, is an artist, and we try to do things that are creative with our 2 little boys.
Hooray. And that's a fantastic, how did it feel to introduce yourself in that way?
It felt good. I'd need some practice.
So a lot of people would...
It's a little scary too.
Yeah, of course. Right.
Too.
And a lot of people would say, oh, that's an introduction exercise. And in fact, it isn't. It's a voice exercise, because it's what it's trying to do is to get us to ask more questions about the presence and volume of our voices, right? How if creativity is the internal motivator for you, how present is that in conversations that you're having, in the work that you're doing? It sounds like it's very present in your work. So that's how I would suggest when somebody says, well, how do I begin this, right? The first is to do some techniques, some exercises that help really unpack some themes that would be present in your voice that may not be so present in our day-to-day lives. And if you do that repeatedly, it's amazing how deep it gets and how many connections you make to things that might not be possible. And so that's one, right? But another exercise has to do with the expectations we carry. And again, in the book, there's a really interesting one which has people go through some affirmations, right? Some true statements, which is, I'll be happy if, I'll be successful if, I'll be peaceful if, I'll be healthy if, I'll be, right? All these affirmations. And then it asks people to act kind of like an anthropologist and say, okay, now look at those affirmations. How many of those are actually still valid? And where are they on the spectrum of way outlive their useful life, kind of okay, or promising, right? Promising this one's new or needs to be nourished more. And so there are kind of a series of awareness exercises around expectations, similar to that one, that can be incredibly powerful in helping us begin. Because I think that very often, a lot of us have been raised in corporate environments where, we know how to make the donuts, right? We can make it happen, right? We know how to do it. And I think a lot of this work asks us to slow down and be thoughtful. And so the exercises are really intended to help you bring your awareness up first, and also recognize that this isn't about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? This is recognizing that we have a composite in our identity, right? It's many things. And some of those things will stay. Some of those are bedrock. And you know what? They've always been right, and they'll continue to be right. But there are other things that, we may have picked up along the way. They were either provisional, we gave them a try and they kind of hung on, or we were told that this is exactly the right thing. And some of those things we might want to let go. And there's a story, I don't think it ever made it to the book. There was this very fascinating woman. She had been the survivor of a traumatic brain injury. And I have to say, there's so many generous people who have participated in my research. And she was one. And she said, a lot of people think that my transformation is that I needed to learn how to walk again. And she's like, I'll be honest with you, it was horrendous. It was really hard, but I did it. And she said, but what I'm realizing is that's really not what it was about. She said, I feel as if right now I'm like standing in my kitchen and I'm taking everything out of the cabinets. And she said, for the first time in my life, I'm looking at everything before I put it back in. She said, like every can I'm holding, like, do I, is this right? And if it is, I put it back on the shelf. And she said, I'm fascinated, but there's a lot on the counter.
Yeah.
And I think that ultimately, when we decide we want to accept the invitation, right? Disruption kind of falls out of our lap, or we expect it, what have you, and we recognize that there's a choice in that. We can kind of slow walk our way into what it might mean by beginning to do some of these awareness exercises. And again, the beauty of it is that those who do get to this kind of expansive point of optimism, particularly after having worked with so many people, there's nothing like it. And can I tell one more story? O'Brien, I don't want to take away your questions.
Well, we're here for.
That's
what we're here for.
So there's this other gentleman whose story is in the book, but he's just an incredible, remarkable man. And I remember him sitting next to me, and he said, I see so much more now. And I was struck by his comment. Most cases, that would not be a remarkable comment. But the man sitting next to me had no sight, right? He had suffered from a degenerative eye condition that basically rendered him nearly 100% sight impaired, right? He had some shadows and such, but you and I we're sighted people, we would say he was not able to see. And the fascinating thing is that he said, for a long period of time, I made changes. And he said, they were right-minded, right? Kind of like your friends, their surround, their colleagues said, oh, do this, do this. He's like, I went out less and less. My world became very small. He's like, I kind of viewed myself as a deficit within a sighted world. And yet then he kind of got invited like to make this choice of going through these transformative exercises where he began to kind of see himself not as lesser than, but to reevaluate his assumptions about who he was and how he was going to make meaning in the world. And that allowed him to do extraordinary things. And he sat there next to me. He's like, Linda, I don't know what you look like. I have no idea what you're wearing. He said, but I see people so differently. And he said, this has unlocked the world for me, that I do see so much more now. And I think that, ultimately I can retell his story and I get goosebumps even just thinking about it. But ultimately, that's what I hope this conversation about disruption does for people, is to trick them off of the track that says, oh my goodness, disruption, and we stall, we disengage, we retreat, we become smaller. When in fact, there's this enormous world out there that is waiting for the gifts that every one of us have. And frankly, we desperately need. But we need to make that choice to reach into how we think about ourselves and be willing to take a little risk.
Well, I was having this conversation with a friend yesterday about, and I stole this from somebody else, but everything good is on the other side of hard work. And this work is hard. And I think that's what people shy away from, is being willing to wrestle with something that is uncomfortable and that challenges your view of yourself. Because I think a lot of us get to a place where we feel that to admit that we don't need a part of ourselves anymore is to admit that that part is bad or wrong, and to admit that then we are flawed. It's a hard thing to do. I've felt that myself, and I've seen it flare up in other people, where everybody knows the conversation they have where they finally have a tough conversation with the person and they say, hey, I don't like it when you do this. And the person goes, well, I'm a terrible person. And and they just, all of a sudden it's the worst case scenario, versus being willing to lean in and say, maybe maybe there is something here. Maybe there's a piece of me that needs to be improved. Not all of me. I'm not bad, but maybe there's a piece of me that has gone a little sour and that needs to be pared away. And so I would just encourage everybody who is interested in this stuff to just embrace that discomfort, because you can't get to the other side and get all these wonderful things that you're talking about, Linda, unless you are willing to sit with it for a little bit.
And I'm so happy you brought that up. I was just going to call you McMahon because I struggle, O'Brien, with your name, and I'm just going to say
we set that up before we started recording.
I told O'Brien that I wrote his name big on the top of my paper right in front of me, so I wouldn't do that. However, chuckle. Okay. The thing that you're mentioning is so common, right? And I'm just going to bucket it in this bucket of emotions, because when we are bold enough to say, wait a minute, I'm going to re-examine kind of who I am, my self-concept, our emotions mobilize to keep us safe, right? Yeah. That is a scientific fact, right? That when we say, okay, I am a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker, and all of a sudden I am bold enough to say, you know what? Maybe I'm not a candlestick maker anymore. Maybe I'm going to do something else. Our emotions read that as unsafe and they go to town. They fire. Also, our emotional system is expert, like it's the most expert computer on the planet, right? Because it knows all of our behaviors and it knows the emotions that will slow us down the fastest, right? So for me, it might be sadness or regret. For somebody else, it might be fear or rage or what have you, right? And so not only do the emotions activate, they activate in an expert systems way, right? So they know, and they know how to slow us down. And a big part of the work that I do in the book and what I do, right, I train coaches and HR professionals on techniques, how to support people through transformation so that they can succeed. And the reframing emotions is the most powerful of all the techniques, right? Because what it does is it says, look, it's as if, let's say sadness, which is my favorite. When sadness is activated for me, it's as if I'm like hanging on the end of the rope and it can like swing me around willy-nilly. It can upend my day, right? Even though I'm super organized, what have you, I know what I need to do. It can still like have this pall over my day. But if I learn how to reframe that emotion, it isn't as if sadness leaves, right? It doesn't like exit stage right. but I can drop that rope on the ground next to me. And it allows me to therefore be and to proceed. I can diffuse the power of that emotion over me. And so, in the book, I talk about 4 activities that we need to kind of embrace in order to move forward through a period of transformation. And the first is reframing emotions, because we really need to diffuse an emotion's power over us so that we can't, as so correctly put, we feel flawed, or we feel if we fail, if I move away from banking, if I was in a banker, well, maybe I've failed, I can't do that, or all sorts of emotions come up. And I think that ultimately there is an opportunity to rethink this, and it makes an enormous difference, because I don't think that we really can proceed without a new way to be with oppositional emotions.
Have you read Stephen Pressfield's The War of Art?
Mm-mm. I don't know it.
So that was what I was thinking when I was reading the chapter on this in the book, because I think did you use the word resistance?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
So Pressfield coins the capital R, resistance. And the War of Art is all about the internal struggle, the war that goes on inside yourself when you are trying to do anything meaningful in the world. And he's a writer, so he has, it's based on his perspective through writing and art, but it's really anything. Anytime you're trying to move, anytime you're trying to transform yourself or the world, you are going to face this inner resistance. And it's interesting because in part of the book, he lays out all the different ways that resistance can appear. And we think oftentimes that it appears as sadness or doubt or these negative emotions, but sometimes it can appear as distraction or going and dating a new partner or cheating on your spouse or like
perfectionism,
drinking too much or whatever. Like for me, as you were talking, I realized for me, when I'm trying to make a big transformation, I go out and I distract myself by making a bunch of transformations all at the same time. And because it's so hard to just focus on the one thing to get better, I go out and I try to do 4 or 5 different things because it distracts me and I sort of over program myself.
I love it. Thank you for that recommendation of the book. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, that's okay. I just to say that it's not always as simple as a negative emotion. I think we all experience those negative emotions, but to realize that it's not only that as well.
No question. Look, resistance can come in so many forms. And I thank you again for the recommendation. I'm going to go find that book, because capital R resistance just permeates this whole process. And I think that ultimately what it typically does is it sends us around another horizontal loop around that mountain. And, some people can choose change and think that that is a positive choice. And in fact, that's just another form of resistance. We're just distracting ourselves. And it can be, by the way, it can take a decade to go on that loop of the mountain. And so, ultimately these questions that we ask ourselves about where we're at and the choices that we have can be incredibly powerful. It can get us off the track of distraction and get us in a very powerful place. And so I do think that a lot of times one of the most fascinating pieces of feedback I learned through my research was that boredom was one of the most common experiences of disruption that people encountered, in that they, for whatever reason, had been in a job or in a circumstance that had long lapsed in its ability to engage their heart or their mind, and that was the biggest form of resistance that they had to go get over. And so I just, again, there's so many circumstances that can bring us to these moments. And I appreciate this conversation, because what I hope it does is encourage people to recognize that there's so much ahead if we can just reframe what's happening and keep going.
Yeah. And before we move off the exercises, I just want to underscore for people, and anyone who's listened to multiple episodes of this show has heard me say something like this before, but we're talking a lot about exercises and thought experiments and asking yourself better questions. And it is one thing to just ask it and think on it, but it is not effective. And not effective in and of itself, at least I have found. You have to, at the very least, talk this out with somebody, to another person. and or write it out, actually journal it out. Because in speaking it to somebody else, like was demonstrated when you asked me to do the values-based introduction, you could see me wrestle with it, right? You could see that it was hard. And it was. And I had to sort of think like, oh, if you were to ask me what my values are, I could list those off. But to say it in a recorded format to another person, now suddenly I start editing myself. And now I want it to come out the right way. And so now I have to process it in a way that makes it more meaningful. And what comes out, then I either go like, well, that wasn't quite right. And I do it again and I can refine it. Or similarly with journaling, being able to write something out forces you to go, well, I mean, how do I actually say this? It's not this nebulous thought I had in my head. It's more this other thing. And so how do I reconcile this? And you have to work through that filter in order to figure out what it is. And I've just found you can't really filter it in your own head. Anything that's going on in your head is unfiltered. And you need to get it out into the real world to be able to either hear it or look at it and see it. And then you can rinse it and reflect on it and cut away the parts that aren't effective. So that's my little soapbox speech for the power of actually doing the exercises in a way that's out into the world.
And I'll just add one little tidbit onto that,
Please.
Particularly for those who like working more on their own, befriend the record button on your phone, right? Because for those who, may not be comfortable writing out things, hit the record and then you can go back and play and listen. Ultimately in the book, there are 10 exercises. Each of the chapters has an exercise and, we've referenced them, but they're really guided reflection. And then after each one, there's an example of somebody in my research who used that. But in the end, ultimately, it's best if we can find colleagues, support structures who can listen to us as we work through some of those because they can ask us important questions. But if you're not the kind of person who has access to those people or doesn't really enjoy that kind of a format, the record button on your phone does wonders because you can play it back and listen and say, wait a minute, did I really say, I didn't mean that. I thought it came out a lot better than that.
Yeah. Well, and anyone who's squirming right now, this is the hard work, right? It's being willing to listen to your own voice. It's being willing to say something that might not be right to somebody else, or being willing to write something down that you might be uncomfortable with. And that is the hard work. And this self-work, I think, is some of the hardest work you can do. So just to encourage everybody, lean into that.
In my research, it came up pretty clearly that it's important to reconstitute the connections that are around us when we go through a period of transformation. And a lot of people ask why, and their assumption is, I have to get rid of people who aren't supporters. And that really isn't the why, right? When we go through a period when we're reformulating the expectations that we're going to rely on to say, hey, I'm okay, I'm loved, I'm happy, right? We have to have expectations in order to do that. We need to really have some validation in that process. And that validation often comes from others. And, oftentimes people say, oh, well, my best friend, I asked her or him, and my spouse or my neighbor, what have you. And I just share with your listeners that, again, it's pretty well documented in the scientific research that those around us, the closest to us, oftentimes have a bias or a need for us to stay the same. And so the notion of reconstituting our connections is really to find a source that can see beyond our invisible walls. And that oftentimes isn't the person who's the closest to you, not because they're out of malice or they don't want the best for you, but they have a strong need for you to stay the same for their own safety and stability. So if you're the kind of person who is okay talking out loud, hit the record button on your phone, or, outreach to other communities that can help listen as you think out loud about how this might go.
I love that. I guess there is one other exercise I wanted to talk about, because I really liked in the book you talking about choice patterns. And this is another thing. You talk about reconstituting yourself. It's one thing to sort of understand what your values are and reset your expectations, but then you're going to have to go out and you're going to have to act on them. And so can you talk to what a choice pattern is and how somebody can get awareness on theirs?
Sure. And it sounds like a fancy term, doesn't it? Choice pattern. It really is this process that helps us be thoughtful about how we've made choices in the past and if there is a pattern to that choice. And so there's this great exercise in the book that is, frankly, it comes out of research in the 60s and 70s on decision making, right? At the time, the whole world loved decision trees and decision matrices. It references a lot of the research that it's built upon. But ultimately, it asks you to say, look, if you think about 3 or 5 big decisions you've made in your life, how did you make them? And the exercise walks you through it, but ultimately, the exercise isn't about judging, right? And it's so quick. We are so quick to judge, I shouldn't have made that, or I did make that one, or that was a good one, that was a bad one. It has nothing to do about classifying. What it does is it just says, how did you make those choices? And it's fascinating. I just did this with a group of very senior executives. One woman who ran a big piece of this public company, she said, I'm really astonished. She said, I'm not sure I ever made any choices. And I think that's a very interesting observation, right? Many people in my research said, look, I got out of college, I needed a job, I got one, and then this and that happened, and I got promotions and, la, 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 la. And all of a sudden, I have this career that from the outside looks fantastic, but I've never really made an active choice to be here. And I think that's just, again, we're not judging it. The notion of a choice pattern says, okay, let's be aware of how we've made choices in the past, because by the way, when we meet disruption, we're invited. Remember, we get that invitation. We're invited to make a choice. And for some, it will be the first choice they've ever made.
Yeah. I love all of this stuff. I am actually working with a coach right now, and we are doing a lot of this work. The exercises aren't the same, but the intent is the same. I mean, I think one of the things I like about doing the show is you figure out what the base principles are that apply across. And I think you lay out some fantastic exercises in your book. I was really impressed as I was reading through them. The exercises I'm going through get to almost the same endpoint. And I think, and that's what's important, is whether you're using Linda's exercises or somebody else's, if you are setting a better definition for who you are and what you want and how you make decisions, that's the important part. So
yes, you will be unstoppable if you go that way.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we are coming up towards the end of time here. Is there anything that we have not covered yet that you would like to share with folks when it comes to disruption and transformation?
First of all, O'Brien, it's been an absolute joy to talk with you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. And the only thing I would say is I invite people to recognize that we can all respond differently to disruption. And if we're willing to be thoughtful about that, we can embark on an expansive path that is really beyond even our wildest dreams. And so I just encourage people to think about this opportunity and chart a new response, because it is quite powerful.
Yeah. And I just want to underscore what you said at the beginning too, which is it's not about making some huge change in your life. It's not about cutting bait, burning the boats, totally upending your life. It's just about making sure that you are living a life that is self-defined and that the choices you are making are being made on purpose as much as they can be. So to the point of my friend who kept most of the things the same, but totally changed his outlook, that's perfectly fine. And I think it's easy when you talk about transformation to get really caught up in, I got to go totally change my life. And it's not necessarily that. For some people it will be, but for some people it won't. And so whatever the change is, even if it's just a small change that makes somebody happy, like that's wonderful. I think there's an opportunity to feel guilty or feel lesser than if you don't feel like you need to make some major change. And I don't want to leave people with that thought either. So whatever change anyone needs to make, I encourage you to make it however small or large.
Well said, my friend.
All right, Linda, thank you so much for the time. Thank you for writing the book. Encourage people to go out and read it. And we will link to that and everything else in the show notes. Thank you to everybody listening, and Godspeed and good luck with your transformations.
Thank you, O'Brien.
Hey folks, one last thing before you go. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date with future guests. That's it. Thanks for coming. Go make the most of your business and the people in it.